Today, I want to ask the question, are we programmed to be unhappy? Now, where do you even start with a doozy of a question like that? Well, I'm going to start with a man named Alexis de Tocqueville, which I am probably butchering the pronunciation of. But in 1835, Alexis de Tocqueville produced something called the Tocqueville Paradox, which has basically gone on to be read as the better society gets, the more we hate it. Now, he puts it a smidgen more eloquently than that by saying, hence it is natural that the love of equality should be constantly increased together with the equality itself, and that it should grow by what it feeds on. His work back in the early 19th century was looking at revolutions and looking at actually what the social status of the communities that were involved in revolutions were. And contrary to what most people might think, it wasn't that society had got so bad that people chose to revolt. It was more to do with the fact that society had got so good that what people would choose to revolt over got smaller. To put simply, the better a society gets, the smaller the problems we elevate into being a bigger problem. Now, I'm not saying that all of the problems that we have today are small by any means. Just check out my episode of the podcast on how social justice and mental health need to be more interwoven. But if we do look around now, we have got into a culture of, instead of rejoicing in how far we have come with things, we become despondent on how far we still have to go. So that's on a societal level. What about for the individual? Well, if you'll permit me to jump nearly another 100 years back in time to 1754, and to another French person, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, again, probably butchered. He did the seminal writing on what later in 1971 became to be coined the Hedonic Treadmill. Now, have you ever said, I'll be happy when? I'll be happy when I get a better job, I'll be happy when I find my partner, I'll be happy when I move house, only to get to that place, have a spike in happiness before ultimately coming back down to your baseline? Well, that's the Hedonic Treadmill in effect. Again, the French seem to have a better way with words than this guy from Liverpool, so I will put it in his words and go with a quote from him, which is, since these conveniences by becoming habitual had almost entirely ceased to be enjoyable, and at the same time degenerated into true needs, it became much more cruel to be deprived of them than to possess them was sweet, and men were unhappy to lose them without being happy to possess them. So to bring that into Dave English, we become accustomed to the things that we get regularly and even take them for granted. And even though we wouldn't want those things taken away from us, we're actually no longer truly happy to possess them. There was a cool anecdotal story I once heard about this when, I think it was United Airlines, they announced for the first ever time, we have free Wi-Fi on board this flight, and the entire plane rejoiced. And then moments later, as you'd expect on the first flight to have free Wi-Fi, the Wi-Fi went down. And the story goes that the airline company received more complaints about that than anything else, in the fact that actually we've just given you something for the first time and then we've taken it away, felt significantly worse than not having the thing in the first place. So now jumping ahead almost into this century to 1971, where psychologist Philip Brickman and Donald T. Campbell took this idea and labelled it the hedonic treadmill. The hedonic treadmill meaning that no matter how much we strive towards happiness, we're never actually getting to a destination. We're just staying in that one same spot. Similar to how when running on a treadmill, we're never actually physically getting anywhere. We are just staying on the spot that we're on. Now they talk about this idea called a happiness set point. And a set point means that yes, good and bad things will happen to us in our lives, and these might temporarily increase our happiness or decrease our happiness accordingly. But ultimately, we are destined to return to this set point, which is just something that is inside each and every one of us. You may be a person with a low set point, and no matter what happens, return to that low set point. You might be a person in a high set point, And again, no matter what happens, you would return to there. This was shown with an experiment looking at two different groups of people. Number one being lottery winners, and number two being people who had lost limbs in life-changing accidents. We're talking paraplegic or even quadriplegic here. And basically, if the person who had won the lottery was predisposed to having a low set point, a low baseline of happiness, of course, winning the lottery would give them all sorts of new freedoms and opportunities, and it would give them that instant dopamine hit and serotonin hit and all of that excitement. But generally, if you followed that person through enough time, their happiness would return to exactly where it was before. They would have just as many problems in life, they'd just be different problems. Similarly, if we were to look at the group of people that were involved in accidents, if they had a sunny disposition, so to speak, before the accident, they would actually find that even though in the moment of the accident itself and maybe the preceding time imminently, they would be considerably less happy. Their happiness would ultimately return up to their previous set point. So it works both ways. Now, this research in 1971 put it across there that basically you're screwed if you've got one of these low set points, and thankfully that is not the case, but we're going to come back to that in a little moment, because before we get to what can be done to alter this, I want to look at two more recent ideas and concepts on what is going on. The first of which is by Dr. Anna Lembke and her book Dopamine Nation. Dr. Anna Lembke works with people with addiction and essentially looks at the motivators behind addiction, the reasons behind addiction, and ultimately the ways out of addiction. Now, she puts across an interesting model of how pleasure and pain work within our brains, which is very easy to understand because she uses the analogy of a seesaw or a teeter-totter for my American audience. This is something I can easily get on board with because if you go way back in my catalogue to 4 or 5 years ago, I talk about how balance isn't incremental changes, it's more of a seesaw, and you can find that video here. The seesaw analogy basically says that the more we push on the side of pleasure, the more our brain is designed to essentially self-regulate by going back to its baseline via pain, meaning the further we strive for pleasure, the more those repercussions are going to be. In fact, we are going to experience pain, discomfort, distress before we actually get back to everything's okay. Instead of saying that life events will cause pleasure, life events will cause pain, she says that life events that cause pleasure will cause pain as a byproduct. This is something I've experienced myself quite heavily in what I call an emotional hangover. Whenever I expose myself to a really big event or something that I'm really excited about, I have to be super gentle with myself for the day or maybe 2 or 3 days following that event, because by comparison, even a normal day feels dismal compared to all of that dopamine, all of that excitement that I'd experienced in the big event. And some even more recent findings come from Dr. Andrew Huberman, who is one of the leading neuroscientists in the world today. And he talks about this idea of dopamine stacking, where you might think, well, okay, Dr. Lemke's work's important if a person is in addiction, but what about a day-to-day person such as myself who isn't in addiction, just does a few things here and there, has things that they enjoy? Well, just like how we've talked in the past about stress and how that can come from so many different angles, and it doesn't matter if you're going through big things or lots of small things, it all adds up. Dr. Huberman says that the same is true when it comes to our dopamine. We can actually be rewarding ourselves with small things here and there throughout the course of the week, and that can all add up to a same volume of dopamine that a person in addiction might be experiencing in a much shorter space of time. Just like how for a person with addiction, their addiction can offset their baseline levels of dopamine and leave them feeling depressed and despondent. It would turn out that according to Dr. Huberman's research, that many small things all added up can do this too. And the worst thing about that is that can probably catch you by surprise, because you probably think, well, I just like to enjoy a bit of food, the odd glass of wine, a nice intense exercise session, and I just put those few things together, maybe work hard, play hard, that kind of attitude. But I'm not really addicted to anything, so why am I now in this period of being unhappy? So let's come back to the initial question. Are we programmed to be unhappy? Well, maybe. But are we destined to be unhappy? That's a more important question here. The thing is that despite the fact that the deck is stacked in a favour, the Tocqueville effect wants to keep us more unhappy the better society gets as a society. The Hedonic Treadmill wants us to stay put exactly where we are in our levels of happiness. The pain-pleasure seesaw reflex means there's a consequence to every bit of pleasure that we're feeling. And then even if we're just conscious enough to just, take it easy on a few different things, it can all stack up and upset our happiness. It does sound a bit bleak at that point, doesn't it? But knowledge is power in this instance, and knowing that this is the case allows us to figure out and to make strides to do something about it. And thankfully, though there are many theories on why we are like this in the first place, there are also many theories on how we can get out of it. Now, I mentioned before that Brickman and Campbell's work has been updated and has been questioned, and this now suggests that the set point is probably about 50%. There's about a 10% genetic component to our happiness, and then actually there's 40% of wiggle room for what we do with our lives. This in itself means that it is no longer a damning sentence held over our heads where we just go, what's the point, and give up. It means that there are actual opportunities for us to move forward and to improve our happiness. The first of which is one that gets talked about so much, gets done by a lot of people, and then gets left and discarded and forgotten about, which is gratitude. Gratitude isn't just something that we do as a brief practice, it is something that you truly have to engage in. It's enabling us to bring our attention to the things that we have and enhance those things. Society, based on the Tocqueville Paradox, is destined to think that things are more and more bleak. The antidote to this is to actually be grateful for how far we've come. Be grateful for the work that is being done now to continue to make our society a better place. Work that you may even be part of yourself. This takes us into something that is called meta feelings, which is feelings about feelings. Have you ever been sad about the fact that you're sad? Have you ever been anxious about how anxious you are? Has anybody ever told you that you could be happy about how happy you are? A personal anecdote I like to share here is that when I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, I was told that I would either be all the way up here or all the way down there and nothing in between. This was terrible advice, because what that meant is I only focused on the highs and the lows. I didn't focus on the day-to-day, on the average. So as a result, I didn't register those days were there, and in my head, the narrative, the story, which wasn't the truth, but was the narrative, said that I'm always either up here or I'm always down here. I didn't even recognize the fact that I had days in the middle until I was in my 20s. Next up is another word that scares a lot of people off: meditation. It's a particular type of meditation called loving kindness meditation. This is a type of meditation where you actually give yourself the kind of compassion that you might give to those that you love. You treat yourself like somebody that you love, and in doing so, you raise your own self-esteem, you raise your own baseline of happiness. I've done some loving kindness meditation myself, and I burst out crying the first couple of times because I clearly just needed that emotional release. Then there is something that Dr. Lembke talks about, which is dopamine fasting. It's not an actual fast, but it is where we restrict not just the thing that we have a problem with, but all things that cause us to have that spike in dopamine. Too many of those spikes in dopamine upsets our baseline and our natural production of dopamine. So having a fast where we abstain from all things such as drink, drugs, porn, sex, junk food, As the list goes on, the inclination to actually follow this goes more and more. Even things like video games and maybe even exercise, because exercise can be another form of addiction. But by having periods of abstinence from this, we allow our body to have a rest from the rampant dopamine production, which ultimately allows it to do its job better when we return. And finally, I would highly recommend following the work of Andrew Huberman. I've put a link in the description to an article that involves several of his lab's ideas on how we can improve our dopamine. Go check that out, because it'd be a whole other video just to go through that. As always, I hope that you've enjoyed this, and I actually hope that you can now get out there and be more happy. I'll catch you on the next one.